Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've long talked about the whole government approach. Frankly, I'm kind of surprised that we don't already, distinguish, I guess, between the different goals on that level. I would think that's fairly basic. But one of the things that I think is more complicated than that is something that happens, it seems to happen and sucks the U.S. in every time, and that is, you go in to do one job, and then all of a sudden you start doing 15 jobs, and there's mission creep. And so how would you suggest that we focus solely on the mission at hand, and what do you do about the situation where you have all of this mission creep so that it ends up taking a toll, and frankly, at the end of the day, you don't really get where you wanted to go? All of you, I guess, or whoever.
Representative, if I may make a stab at that question. Part of the problem comes back to the broader issue of having no strategy and not having criteria that allow us to draw distinctions between our adversaries. Because we haven't had a strategy based on categories and priorities of threat, we have instead relied on doctrine, whether it's counterterrorism doctrine or counterinsurgency doctrine. And doctrine is very, very important. It explains how you use your force and your resources in a given theater to achieve the objectives in that theater. But it doesn't answer the broader questions of strategy and policy as to whether that theater is worth the investment and how much of an investment you're willing to make in the theater. So if we want to be able to understand how to limit mission creep, if we want to be able to identify the scope of our engagement in some of these theaters around the world, or the way that we assist allies and friends in some of these theaters around the world, we have got to have a very clear and very precise understanding of who our adversary is, how they interact with other groups, and how our interests are implicated by the same.
Anybody else?
Well, I took a stab at this a bit in my opening statement when I talked about second-order consequences when there are U.S. military commitments. I think even if we have a very clear understanding of who our enemy is, as, for example, we did in Somalia when committing to supporting Ethiopian military action in late 2006, sometimes mission creep occurs anyway. Part of the problem is, number one, when ahead of time it's not clear exactly what our goal is. Is it just to displace an enemy? Is it to try to stabilize a state? What if the enemy is then going to come back unless you stabilize the state? And as you start to ask those questions after making that initial commitment, that can cause a mission naturally to creep. Now, one way we've dealt with that, I think, is by moving towards more multilateral efforts. For example, in Somalia, even though I think one could accurately say that there's been U.S. mission creep, the U.S. has kept its mission rather limited. It's in a very supporting role as opposed to being at the forefront, while both AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia, and also other local countries have taken the lead on the ground. Likewise, in Mali, I think that's another area where the U.S. made a commitment, but overall it was allied forces as opposed to the United States that was in the forefront. I think that defining the enemy, setting goals are good criteria, but that's not going to solve mission creep in and of itself. And I think that when we make U.S. commitments, we always have to factor in that mission creep is going to be likely at the very outset. And to that extent, especially when something is very marginal to our strategic interests, we should think very carefully about whether we should make that commitment in resources and potentially in lives.
I think the danger of mission creep is an important one to consider. I mean, I served for almost a decade in Afghanistan and a few other theaters in U.S. Special Operations, so saw mission creep up close. I think the mentality here has got to shift, and I think it has begun a little bit, to one where we don't have to do it ourselves. And this is something several of us have said on this panel. We have got to work much better than we do with partnering nations in the countries we're operating with, and then our allies. So the French example, so mission creep, we could have gone down a mission creep avenue in Mali. We did not. The French felt particularly threatened. This is their colonial era. They actually went in. U.S. provided limited intelligence and a few other things. The French provided the vast majority of combat power with the Malian government. That was an example, I think, of the U.S. interests were minimal. It was a Salafi jihadist group or series of them operating. The threats weren't that serious. And so in that case, it was well within reason to support local Malian and local French allies. The problem, and this is where this is going to get a little challenging, is what do we do in countries where there's a very acute threat to American security, national security, active plotting against the U.S. homeland, and very little government capacity on the ground. That's the problem we face in Afghanistan. I still think that will be a challenge in countries like that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.